What's the most important skill for a quilter? In my experience, it is to sew a perfect 1/4 inch seam. It decides about success or failure in your patchwork. It is not too hard to master, and I'll show you how. My name is Brigitte Heitland of ZEN CHIC, and if you like this video, then please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you get notified each time when I publish a new one.
Why is it so important to sew a 1/4 inch seam perfectly? In patchwork, we sew blocks together to form a surface. The blocks should all be the same size to fit in a grid, for example in columns and rows, which can then be sewn together again. The blocks again are sewn together from several pieces. Imagine a block has 8 vertical seams. If each seam deviates only 1 millimeter from the perfect size, then the entire block deviates about 3/8 inch from the desired size at the end. It may not fit into the grid anymore, and the whole quilt might be warped. That's why it is so essential to master the seam allowance perfectly. How exactly do you sew the perfect seam allowance? First, we check how our 1/4 inch seam usually turns out. Cut one black and 2 white strips, each 1.5 by 5 inch. Sew the white strip with your 1/4 inch seam allowance between the black strips. Press the seams towards the dark fabric. Now place your ruler on this sample and read the middle strip. This should be exactly 1 inch wide. If so, congratulations! You have the perfect setup for sewing exact blocks and quilts. In my classes, many quilters who have been sewing for a long time don't achieve the perfect size in their test sample. This can often be simply because they rely on their sewing machine settings. But every sewing machine and presser foot is a little bit different, and that can lead to small deviations. If you ever changed a sewing machine, for example with a rental machine in a class, this is my advice. Even if you have the 1/4 inch seam under your belt, sew a test piece first to check your perfect seam allowance on that new machine. What helps you achieving a perfect 1/4 inch seam? Number 1, the right presser foot. There are so-called 1/4 inch presser feet, some with an additional guide bar. You position the edge of the presser foot exactly on the fabric edge. Number 2 is a seam guide, and there are different ones on the market. Some of them are simple magnets. Once you have inserted this presser foot or guide bar, sew a sample again and measure this test sample. If you now have the exact 1 inch width as a result, everything is fine and you can continue sewing with these settings in the future. If you still don't get the exact desired finished size, despite a 1/4 inch feet or additional seam guides, there can be a reason. The fabric itself has a certain thickness. If it is flipped over while pressing, it will lose a little of its width as the graphic shows. Experienced quilters know this. They use a so-called scant 1/4 inch seam. What does scant mean? It means putting the needle a hair to the right of the exactly drawn 1/4 inch line. This takes the thickness of the fabric into account. How can you set up the scant 1/4 inch seam for your sewing machine? Some machines allow the needle to be moved to the right or left in very small steps. I sew on a Bernina, and I set up the scant 1/4 inch seam in a way that I move my needle 1 step to the right, and I use a 1/4 inch foot and a seam guide. That gives me perfect results. But not every sewing machine allows these fine adjustments. Older or simpler sewing machines in particular do not provide adjustment of a needle. Sometimes not even a 1/4 inch presser foot. But that's no reason to despair. I will show you a very simple method of how you can set up each machine for the perfect 1/4 inch seam. Download and print out the 1/4" seam template. Cut it off exactly on the line with the word cutting edge. Place the paper under your presser foot. Now insert the sewing needle exactly a hair wide next to the seam line. The paper is now fixed. Next, you align it so that the cutting edge is exactly straight. Lower the presser foot so that the paper remains fixed. Next, you take a small cardboard strip about 8" by 1.5" and 1/16" thick. The thickness of the cardboard helps you as a leading edge for your fabric. Now place this cardboard against the fixed paper edge. Glue the piece of cardboard with an adhesive strip so that it is well fixed but could also be folded away to the side. Maybe you have to fold it away every now and then when you change the spool or for other reasons. That way you don't have to set up your cardboard strip every time again. With this setup, sew another sample. If you did everything correctly, your test seam should now be perfect. If it is still too wide or too narrow, you will have to correct the setup again. That sounds cumbersome, but it's actually only a one-off process, a well-invested time. Set up your cardboard so that it will now be a reliable guide in the future to sew the perfect 1/4" seam every time. How are your machine settings? Do you get the perfect 1/4" seam every time? Please let me know in the comments below.
Now I want to show you quickly how you can help yourself once your block has become too large or too small, which is also a very common problem.
Actually, you have to choose the right solution for each quilt each time. In our example at the beginning, we had vertically striped blocks that can be made narrower or wider by sewing, but never longer or shorter. If these blocks are placed alternately in a quilt, they have to be exactly square. In this case, if the blocks are too narrow, you must shorten the length of all blocks so that they match the width and are square. If the blocks are too wide, you have to narrow them down so that they match the length and are square again. If you have, for example, symmetrical blocks that are all evenly too big or too small, you can help yourself that way. You leave them as they are. Since all blocks are too large or too small in the same way, they still fit together. Basically, the whole quilt just gets either a little bit larger or smaller. If your quilt becomes too small for a particular purpose, for example, if the bed is no longer completely covered, you can still add a border. For a sampler quilt, however, you need a bit more accuracy. In this quilt, blocks of very different dimensions come together in a so-called irregular grid. Here you have to have the exact required size so that everything fits together nicely and the quilt top lies flat. What to do with too large blocks? You can cut these blocks a little bit smaller, but be careful, sometimes you cut off the tips of triangles, which looks ugly. That is why it is so important to have the seam set up in the best possible way right from the start. Too small blocks can be stretched a little. Try this trick. Draw the desired size, your block size including seam allowance, on a piece of paper and put the paper on your ironing board. Moisten your finished block with a little water. Now pin it with pins so that the fabric edges match exactly the edge of the drawing. Your block will be stretched a lot, which is actually only possible when it is wet. Once all is pinned in place, put a ruler and a couple of weighting books on the block. Let it dry overnight. The next day you remove the weight and the pins, The dried block has now adapted the new dimension and can be used in your sampler quilt. This is a solution to compensate for minor deviations.
As you can see, all these troubles fall away once you have got the 1/4 inch seam under your belt. So by then, patchwork becomes very joyful, makes a lot of fun and is successful.
Check also out my video playlist on more sewing skills. If you liked this video, hit that like button, be sure to subscribe and share it with your friends.